Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on Lake George Radio, 93.5 FM, and live streaming at lakegeorgeradio.com. Here's local historian Bruce Venter.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Bruce Venter. I am a trustee of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, and today our guest is Andrew Menzie, and he is the Director of Historical Interpretation at Fort William Henry. And we've asked Andrew to come here today to talk about the siege of Fort William Henry that took place in August of 1757. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Thanks very much, Bruce. I can't talk about the siege without setting up the 1755 after the battle. The fort is constructed. At the same time, the French are building Ticonderoga, which they call Carillon. For almost 2 years, the two sides stare at each other, who's going to make the first move, and the French do that in March of 1757. That derails the rather scattered British plans to see if they could continue to move up towards Crown Point, Ticonderoga, always their goal, but never really reached in the last couple of campaigns. When the French come down in March, they scatter the British plans by burning a lot of the boats that hadn't been sunk, put under the water, and that destroys the British ability to dominate the lake, and therefore the French are able to complete their plans. Since they can't take the fort in March, they are going to come down in August, having completed their 500 boats and the supplies and ammunition for 8,000 men. They'll come down the lake with 40 cannon, 2,000 Native American allies, over 1,000 French regulars, and French, Canadian militia and Troupe de la Marine, with which they'll surround the fort and for the next 5.5 days gradually pound it into submission.
Do you think the British should have held the fort to the end, or to fall back from Lake George and make the stand at Fort Edward where General Webb was, where they would have more men? Because Webb was not going to send reinforcements up that military road.
No. Of course, considering the situation, I think that's not a bad move, but of course it assumes the absence of Webb and his ineptitude, just a massive amount of inertia. A better strategy probably would have been to drop back and hold Edward, because they almost certainly could have.
Well, that brings me to a tip for all of our listeners, that on August the 8th at 7 p.m., we have a talk on the commander of Fort William Henry at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Monroe, by George Bray, a very accomplished historian, reenactor, to be at the Fort William Henry Conference Center, and we would encourage everyone to come. It's a free lecture, and maybe I'll ask the same question to George Bray about whether Colonel Monroe should have held the fort. And for those of you who are interested in attending George Bray's talk on Colonel Monroe, you would register at info@lakegeorgebattlefield.org.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on Lake George Radio, 93.5 FM, and live streaming at lakegeorgeradio.com. If you have any questions regarding Lake George Battlefield Moments, email info@lakegeorgebattlefield.org. And tune in every Saturday morning at 9:45 for Lake George Battlefield Moments.